At Capella University, education is as smart as the world around us. With the FlexPath format, you can take classes at your own pace, set your own deadlines, and even leverage your previous experience to move faster. Now that's smart. Learn more at capella.edu.
The Traveler's Inn, Tangled Skein, Episode 7. Say the magic word. Say it! Mogits threw his arms up to protect his face from the fall. The ball of fire touched his hair, and a wave of intense heat ran back along his head. The smell of singed hair and the crackle of crisping skin filled his senses. Flinging the flaming orb away, he crashed to the floor face first and felt his nose pop. His feet were still entangled in the sticky mess along the wall. Rolling onto his back, he looked up at the others. Manx was awake and twitching as the 8-legged jailers clambered across his face and body to get away from the expanding melt of flames and webs. Blueberry was at Gunther's wrists, gnawing away at his bonds to free him, just as she'd done for Luna. Mogits had always been able to see the dragon since entering the inn, but the wizard had noticed that few others could. Gunther did, but Manx and Luna didn't. He just figured it was something to do with magical aptitude. He had it, and the others didn't. The conjured creature was hard-headed, though, and definitely had a mind of her own, something Mogits hadn't encountered in summoned energy. He found it fascinating and wondered how many times that had happened before. He had a vague idea of where the gnomes, Darome's, skill levels were, but a spell like this should be way beyond the man's ability. It may have been the magic of the inn, though. Mogits had noted the oddities of the building, the shifting and changing doors that appeared in a haze and dissipated like a morning fog, and the people within spoke volumes of the magical magnetism of the place. The wizard had seen the dragon-blooded standing at the top of the stairs when he'd entered. The guy was a legend, literally. Grenadal had gone toe-to-toe, physically and mentally, with necromancers, demons, and otherworldly beings. The man was a caster also, but dealing in other sorts of magics than what Mogits dabbled in. The wizard lay on his back, staring at the ceiling and wondering if Hugh Blueaxe, a longtime friend and companion of Grenadal, ever came to the inn. That was when he noticed the flames licking the rafters. Tilting his head further back and lifting his shoulders from the wooden planks of the floor, Mogits' world turned upside down. The table where the flaming orb had landed was a sheet of fire, with a column of orangey yellow dancing atop the surface like the element just wanted a pole and a stage to do its art. Mogits smiled at the thought of a curvy, sexy elemental made of... The man sat bolt upright, spinning where he sat to look at the inferno. The danger had already spread along the rafters, the webbing and sizzling and popping forms of the spiders feeding its frenzy. Now it was beginning to waterfall, an oxymoron if Mogits had ever heard one, over the side of the table and onto the wooden planks of the floor. It was like watching the love child of a mysterious fog and an excitable grease fire take its first steps. Leaping to his feet, the wizard called upon all his magical knowledge, summoning every bit of wisdom and learning he'd collected in his time working with the arcane arts. And nothing. Yeah, he had nothing that would help. A sudden yell made Mogits jump. Luna, in all her warrior maiden glory, was hefting a stout leg of a table that she'd apparently broken off with her bare hands, and shouting her battle cry as she charged the man in the box. Manx, freed from his bonds, dropped to the floor. The gang member turned master thief was in a crouch, one hand splayed on the floor between his widespread knees, the other held out and slightly behind him for balance. The rogue surveyed the scene through a squint and a scowl, his usually bored and pouting expression forgotten. He actually looks Interested, Mogits thought. Moist Manx looks all intense and engaged. I've never seen him like this. The kid's hands twitched, and thin-bladed stilettos flashed in his grip. Manx looked to one side, then the other, his head moving the slightest bit. Then he melted into the dancing shadows caused by the flames, disappearing from Mogits' sight. A loud thump from the wizard's other side drew his attention. Gunther lay on the floor, moaning and rolling onto his back. Blueberry cooed and rubbed her snout against the barbarian's jawline. The flames continued to flare away from where Mogits had hung only moments before, like the iris of some angry god. Or mother. Tightly wrapped cocoons appeared in the shadows, vaguely humanoid-shaped, though they resembled bound coffins more than actual people. Green magical threads of silk extended from the top of these bundles, and the wizard could see the throbs of magical energy pulsating outward. It was like watching a visual representation of a heartbeat, each rhythmic pounding, pushing the energy to where? Mogits lifted his head, following the strands of arcane conduits, trying to trace where they led to, and for what purpose. They were also as fire-resistant as the cocoons themselves, enchanted with the power of something more than just spider butts. The lines led to beams on the walls, and they glowed in a deeper, pulsing light. They throbbed, the energy coursing to the center of the room towards Derek. Mogits looked at the master of the tower. The mage in a box was spinning in circles around Luna Rose, who was bashing madly at the foe. The woman was in full rage, her eyes wild, foam frothing from her lips as she screamed out unintelligible threats. In the shadowed recesses on the other side of the room, Mogits saw Manx moving through the dim dancing haze of smoke and light. The thief was killing spiders with every movement, but there were hundreds of the things. Just a couple of meters from the wizard, Gunther sat up, dazedly blinking at the room with unfocused eyes. Okay, Mogits breathed out to calm himself. It's time to pull myself together and then pull them together. First things first, let's get the big guy on his feet and point it in a direction where he can either do the most help or at least the most damage. The wizard moved to the barbarian's side, glancing at the ethereal dragon trying to cuddle the warrior. Gunther! Mogits grabbed the big guy by the crisscrossed leathered straps of his empty sword scabbards and pulled their faces together. You gotta get up! You were right, and we need you to do it right now! The barbarian muttered. Do what? You are right. It's the best plan. You gotta get our stuff from the corner over there. Mogits grabbed Gunther's chin and turned the man's head to look towards the pile of their gear that had been discarded to one side. And I will do some magic stuff or something. Brilliant plan. I couldn't have come up with a better one myself, no matter how hard I tried. You're the boss and a genius. Okay, Gunther grunted. Now get up. The wizard strained to pull the big man to his feet. And Blueberry, you help guide him. Make sure he doesn't get eaten by, those things he doesn't like. The dragon hissed, twisting her neck towards the wizard for a moment. Turning back to her beloved human, she stood on the man's shoulder and grabbed twin tufts of hair, ready to steer her favored steed into action. Is it spiders? The barbarian asked. I hate spiders. They make my tummy upset. Nope. Mogits patted the man on the shoulder, giving him a push in the right direction. Definitely not those. You got this. Go get him. The wizard watched the man totter away like a giant, buff baby toddling towards something shiny. One down. Who's next? Luna wielded a table leg in one hand and a twisted brass candelabra in the other, bashing at Derek in a dazzling display of bashery. Green sparks flew from an unseen dome protecting the enemy. The ineffectiveness of the attacks enraged the warrior priestess even more. "Well, she's keeping him busy," Mogits muttered. "Now, where's that kid?" A glance around the chamber showed Manx walking along a wooden plank that encircled the room at 4 meters off the floor, slashing at the inhabitants in a flurry. "Okay, time to redirect him." The wizard raised his voice. "Manx! The golems! Look for a thick cord of webbing. Cut it! That's what's delivering the villager and the cocoons, life forces, to the bastard controlling the spiders. Severing that will be like severing his lifeline." The thief nodded the smallest nod and turned his attention from what he was doing. He leapt across the open air from the wall to a supporting column 3 meters away. The kid landed nimbly, like a cat turned lumberjack, flinging himself from tree to tree to make the next cut. "That's 2, Mogits grinned. 3 if you count the distraction tank in the center there. Now, how am I really going to finish this? Put out the flames? Oh my, they are spreading quickly. Thank goodness the wood here is pretty much petrified, or we'd all be dead already." A section of the floor near the center fell away. Tables, test tubes, and other equipment spilled into the void, and a column of green flame shot upward for a moment. Perhaps I spoke too soon. Mogits backed away from the collapsing floor, looking towards Luna. The warrior priestess threw her makeshift weapons away, squatted, and grabbed a small round table by the legs catty-corner to one another. Standing up, the table held in front of her like a giant shield, she charged Derek. Slamming into the wooden casing hovering above the ground, the massive box shifted backwards towards the newly opened hole. "Here!" Mogits was shoved back a step as the barbarian pushed a bag into the wizard's arms. Gunther continued running past the mage, heading for Manx. The dragon clung to the warrior's shoulder, glaring at Mogits. "Moist catch!" the barbarian shouted, throwing the thief's satchel towards where the young man sawed at tangled knots of spider silk. Without looking up, Manx held out one hand, caught the strap of the bag, twisted his wrist and elbow up and back, and the satchel settled over his head and around his body. The northern warrior made a 90-degree right turn and headed for Luna, his duffel and her backpack over his shoulder each, his enormous sword slapping his buttocks in its leather scabbard. Gunther snatched up a long, thin table and held it in front of him, like a spearman's body shield, charging towards the master of the tower. Upon contact, a burst of white light flared, followed by a noise that shook the stones of the building and sounded like 100 giants clapping in unison. The only time a noise like that had been heard before was during a historic meeting of the giant clans of the north, just a few days' walk from where Gunther's tribe winters. The opening speaker started with a joke on this very rare and solemn moot, and was met with that singular response. Instead of laughing, slapping weapons to shields, cheering, booing, or making any other noise, every single giant clapped once, and all at the same time. Skalds tell that trees still don't grow in that grotto out of fear of another clap occurrence, and even rocks avoid the place unless they have a thick coat of moss to protect them. To this day, northern barbarians never open a meeting with a joke. Gunther's people still speak of the day all the trees shed their leaves with a single shudder, and how the reindeer learned to avoid that entire region. As a side note, the frostbitten barbarian clan changed their winter home, and now young warriors are tested by sending them to the place of the giant's thundermoot, and are required to recover a single twig that is still shivering in fear of that day. The adventurers, spiders, tables, and all the things in the tower were thrown backwards against the outer wall from the noise and subsequent sound wave. "He's still getting power," Mogits muttered from the corner he landed in. "We're not going to make it if this keeps up. I need to reverse the polarity." "Nah, Just make it go from suck to blow. Mogits spun in a circle, looking for a way to do what he just described. But how? How do I make the magic he's drawn on, the life forces of dozens of villagers that have already been drawn into him, reverse and blow out his power? And will it kill us? Mogits asked the smoky air around him. Whatever. The wizard shrugged and began chanting, Abracadabra! Pulling on the arcane energies, he drew the magic he could see into himself. On one hand, it might give him all the power the enemy had drawn into himself, and he could use it to do amazing things. On the other hand, it might burn him out, turning him into a charred husk of magical residue. The wizard watched as the poor, dumb warriors charged the guy again, tables at the ready to push Derek back, and over the precipice into the green torrent of energy guttering upward from the floor below. He did have the thought that he was happy he'd looted the room below before he did this. Loot, he groaned. I haven't checked the shelves here for magical items and books. The process had already begun. But Mogits scanned the room in desperation, his natural greed fighting the oddly foreign impulse to save everyone. To the east, a wand on a stand glowed with power. In the south, a small device wavered with the enchantment of sound, and scattered around the room, 15 books shimmered with an energy that showed that they might, possibly, probably, contain spells he could learn. A slow surge built within him, a special, specific tickle that reminded him of that one time, his first time, with a woman. She had charged him for the wave of overpowering and delightful pleasure she'd given him, and the rupturing pulse of magnificent ecstasy he'd felt that night. But this was on a different level. He felt it from his soul to his toes to a tingle in his head. His vision cleared and sharpened, so exquisite and different from that moment of juvenile delight. Instead of overwhelming him, it focused him. So much power. He pulled, reaching out with his hands to lend motion to intent. Alakazam! The wizard exclaimed, holding out his hands to receive his prizes. The wand snapped to his waiting palm, covering the distance of the room in a second. The small listening device flew to his other hand. Then the books came towards him. His heightened awareness showed the more than a dozen tomes gliding across the space. They were huge and heavy. And then they hit him, all at once. He went sprawling. Sitting up and taking stock, he saw the warrior and priestess hit the enemy caster, and the box of a man slid backwards towards the hole. His plunger and overgrown egg beater whirled ineffectively in the air as he was pushed backwards, teetering on the edge of the precipice. Mogits pushed the energy away from him, feeding the extra towards the imprisoned silk tombs of the villagers. Energy danced along the silk bonds, washing over and soaking into them. The casings around the villagers split. People rained down, falling to their knees, faces, and in general slumping to the ground. But they were moving, and probably even breathing. He'd done it. That was when the entire room erupted in magical green flames. It didn't burn, but instead it pulsed with power, alternatively drawing from the people and filling them. Everyone swooned, except Derek, who slowly slid backwards, accoutrements flailing, and into the pit behind him. Then he dropped from sight. A gout of verdant power burst upward, and the ceiling shattered, sending stones into the dusk sky, which wasn't the problem. In fact, it was kind of cool. It was when the building blocks of the tower started coming back down that Mogits saw how it might be bad. "To the spiral staircase!" Mogits shouted. The wizard scrambled, snatching up the wand and small swirly device that had hit his hands moments ago and shoved them into his backpack. The flames devoured everything as many of the villagers pushed to their feet and staggered towards the wrought iron stairs that spiraled upward to the roof and... Cupula? Gazebo? That little bump of a building on the roof. Manx leapt through the flames like a specter of death, soot and webbing trailing from him in streamers. He pushed and herded the townsfolk towards the only exit available. The mighty Gunther. Mogits hesitated as he realized how heroic the man looked. Lifted 3 people and carried them towards the aperture that might mean escape and living. The dragon darted ahead, leading the way for her human. Luna called upon the power of her goddess, and the devouring flames of magic bent away from her as she shepherded a half-dozen people towards the steps. When the woman reached the metal stairs, she uttered more words, and the purifying waters of her goddess burst from thin air to douse the glowing metal steps. The metal warped and bent, but the people could put their feet on them and start the climb to the fresh night air and potential freedom. "Freedom?" Mogits coughed. How are we going to get off the roof? Maybe we can climb down or use a rope or something?" The wizard pushed to his feet, his backpack bulging with books. He'd only gotten less than a half-dozen into his pack, but he thought they were the good ones. The idea of losing knowledge made him queasy. Not because of civilization and recovering hoarded magics lost through the greed of others. No, not ever that. This was about him. Really it was. But because he wanted an easier life. The arcane formulas and power within these books could mean he could retire and maybe even buy a little inn of his own. Then he could just charge people to help them, making a comfortable living through other people's laziness and hope. He darted for the stairs, weaving between bursts of flame and scurrying spiders. He reached the steps last, looking back to see the few people who didn't make it, writhing in the torrents of fire. I don't care. They don't matter, Mogits choked. Not from emotion, but from the smoke, he told himself. At least I survive. They don't matter. I don't care. He put a foot on the spiraling metal and turned away from the people screaming behind him. Then he moved onward. The explosion from below threw the mage up, his body tumbling along the underside of the stairs before being launched into the waiting night sky. Gravity called for its due, and he fell back down and hit the outer circle of the parapet of the rooftop. The center of the tower exploded, and stones the size of loaves of bread fell towards the helpless mage.
At Capella University, you're in control of your education. With the game-changing FlexPath format, you can set your own deadlines and move at your own pace. The faster you move, the more you save. Visit capella.edu to learn more.